Every military strategy eventually becomes predictable, not because the people executing it lack imagination, but because the logic of available resources, geographic constraints, and operational necessity narrows the range of viable choices over time until an adversary with sufficient intelligence and sufficient analytical patience can map those choices with enough accuracy to build defenses around them. Russia had been building its defenses around Ukraine's strike strategy. For 3 years, tracking the systems Ukraine used, the approach vectors those systems favored, the target categories Ukrainian military planners prioritized, and the operational patterns that 3 years of repeated execution had embedded into the rhythm of the campaign. The Russian air defense architecture that had been progressively reinforced across those 3 years was not built against an abstract threat. It was built against the specific strike strategy Ukraine had been executing, refined through operational learning on both sides, into a competition whose parameters both sides understood well enough to plan around. What Russia did not expect, and what the events of the week beginning May 19, 2026 demonstrated with a clarity that left no room for the ambiguity that military setbacks sometimes permit, was that Ukraine had been quietly building a strike strategy its adversary had not been studying because it had not yet been used, a strategy whose architecture had been developed in parallel with the visible campaign, tested in components through operations that had not been publicly framed as tests, and deployed for the first time at full operational scale in a week that changed what both sides understood was possible and what the conflict's remaining trajectory would look like. If this is the kind of reporting you want, no spin, no shortcuts, the full picture, subscribe right now. It takes 2 seconds and it keeps this work going. Because what Ukraine's new strike strategy represents is not simply a tactical evolution. It is a strategic reorientation whose implications extend from the front lines in eastern Ukraine to the defense planning sessions of every military in the world that is watching this conflict as a laboratory for understanding what modern warfare between serious adversaries actually looks like when both sides have 3 years of learning built into their operational systems. To understand why the new strategy changes everything, you have to start with the limitations of the old one. Not because the old strategy failed, but because understanding precisely where its ceiling was explains why breaking through that ceiling matters as much as it does. Ukraine's strike campaign through the first 3 years of the conflict had operated within constraints that were simultaneously technological, political, and geographic. The technological constraint was range. The systems Ukraine had access to for deep strikes into Russian territory had effective ranges that, combined with the political constraints its Western partners had imposed on their use, created a strike envelope that Russian planners could map and build defenses around. The political constraint was the progressive but always limited relaxation of those range restrictions, which meant that every expansion of Ukraine's reach into Russian territory was preceded by a period of negotiation and signaling that gave Russian planners advance warning to harden the targets most likely to be added to Ukrainian strike. The packages. The geographic constraint was the physical reality of a front line that had stabilized across most of its length, which channeled Ukrainian strike planning into patterns that Russian air defense positioning had been optimized to defeat. The new strategy Ukraine deployed in the week of May 19th operated on all three of those constraints simultaneously, not by resolving them individually, but by building an operational architecture designed to make them collectively less binding than they had been when each was addressed in isolation. The architecture had three components, each representing a genuine innovation in Ukrainian military practice, and the combination of all three, operating simultaneously, was what produced the results that Russian military analysts and Kremlin officials were still processing days after the week's operations concluded. The first component was the development and operational deployment at scale of a new category of Ukrainian domestic strike system that had been under development since late 2023 and whose existence had been partially visible in occasional tests. Operations, but whose full operational capability had not been demonstrated before May 19th. The system, a long-range drone platform developed by Ukrainian defense industry with a combination of domestic engineering and component sourcing through supply chains that Ukrainian procurement had been building over 2 years, had an effective range of approximately 1,800 kilometers when launched from positions within Ukrainian-controlled territory. That range placed targets deep inside Russia that had previously been outside any realistic Ukrainian strike envelope within operational reach for the first time. And it did so with a system that was domestically produced, not subject to the use restrictions that governed Western-supplied systems, and available in quantities that reflected 2 years of production investment rather than the limited stocks that had constrained earlier Ukrainian long-range strike operations. The second component was a fundamental change in how Ukrainian strike packages were structured and sequenced that reflected a specific lesson drawn from the Alabuga operation and the Crimea operation of the preceding week. Both of those operations had demonstrated the effectiveness of multi-phase strike packages that targeted different layers of a defended position's architecture in sequence rather than simultaneously, using electronic warfare to degrade coordination. Before physical strikes arrived, using drone saturation to exhaust short-range defenses before cruise missiles targeted the primary aim points, the new strategy generalized that lesson from specific high-value target operations into the standard architecture of Ukrainian strike planning across all target categories, creating a systematic approach to layered defense defeat that replaced the previous pattern of large simultaneous strike packages with coordinated sequential packages, designed to exploit the specific vulnerabilities that each preceding phase created. The practical difference between the two approaches is significant in ways that matter for how Russian air defense systems can respond. A simultaneous large-scale strike package creates a single, identifiable engagement window, a period, during which air defense operators know they are under attack, can activate all available systems, and can prioritize their intercept allocations against the full threat picture they can observe. A coordinated sequential package creates a series of engagement windows, each appearing before the previous one has fully resolved, each presenting a different threat profile that requires different system responses, and each arriving as the defending systems are still managing the resource consumption and operational state produced by the previous phase. The cognitive and resource demand on defending operators in a sequential package environment is categorically higher than in a simultaneous package environment, and Ukrainian planners had designed the new strategy's package architecture around that specific difference. The third component was the most strategically significant and the one whose implications extended furthest beyond the immediate operational results of the week's strikes. Ukraine had developed, over the preceding 6 months, a distributed targeting intelligence network operating inside Russian territory, a combination of human intelligence sources, remotely operated sensors, and signals intelligence collection assets positioned in ways that provided real-time targeting data for strike operations against mobile and semi-mobile Russian military assets that had previously been effectively protected by their mobility. The targeting challenge that mobile assets present to a strike campaign is specific and well understood. A target that moves between the time intelligence identifies it and the time a strike asset reaches its location is effectively immune to pre-planned strikes, and the strike campaign must either accept that mobile targets are not targetable or develop the intelligence and response speed architecture required to engage them in the window between detection and movement. Ukraine's distributed targeting network provided for specific categories of mobile Russian military assets: logistics vehicles, mobile command posts, air defense system components in transit between positions, fuel and ammunition trucks moving on supply routes, a targeting data flow whose latency was sufficiently low to permit engagement before movement rendered the intelligence stale. The network had been tested in components in earlier operations. The week of May 19th was the first time it was operated at a scale and integration level that made it a systematic instrument rather than an experimental one. And the results against the mobile target categories it was designed for were visible in the operational outcomes of the week's strikes in ways that Russian military analysts recognized immediately as representing a qualitative change in Ukraine's targeting capability rather than a quantitative increase in its strikes volume. The targets Ukraine struck in the week of May 19th, taken together, formed a pattern that reflected the new strategy's operational logic more clearly than any single strike could communicate. The week's operations targeted 5 categories, simultaneously, each chosen to stress a different component of Russia's ability to sustain its current operational tempo. Russian air defense system components, specifically the S-400 batteries and their supporting radar and command vehicles, were targeted at 17 locations across a geographic spread that had not been achievable before the new long-range domestic systems deployment. The targeting of air defense assets at this scale and geographic distribution was not designed to destroy Russia's air defense architecture, which is too large and too distributed for any strike campaign to eliminate comprehensively. It was designed to create a maintenance burden, a requirement to move, reassess, and reconstruct battery positions across a wide area simultaneously. That stresses the logistics and personnel systems supporting air defense operations in ways that degrade overall system performance without requiring the destruction of individual systems. Russian logistics infrastructure on the supply routes serving the Eastern Front was targeted through a series of strikes against road and rail junctions, fuel storage facilities, and vehicle maintenance depots at locations that the targeting network had identified as the highest throughput points on the routes most critical to sustaining Russian frontline supply. The targeting was precise enough to be operationally meaningful and geographically broad enough to prevent Russian logistics management from simply rerouting around the affected points. The simultaneous disruption of multiple junctions across a supply network forces operational pauses and rerouting decisions that compound into delays, measurable in days rather than hours, and delays in frontline supply. At the operational tempo Russian forces were maintaining translated directly into reduced fire support availability at the points on the front line where Russian tactical operations were most dependent on sustained artillery. Defense industrial infrastructure supporting the production of the systems Russia most needed to replace in the aftermath of the Alabuga destruction was targeted at 3 facilities in the Ural industrial region, locations that the new long-range domestic system could reach and that earlier strike operations had not been able to address because they lay outside the effective range envelope of the systems previously available. The strikes on Ural region defense industrial facilities were not individually catastrophic in the way that the Alabuga operation had been. They were individually significant and collectively part of a systematic approach to the Russian defense industrial base that was beginning to operate not as occasional disruption but as sustained pressure, a campaign within the campaign targeting the production capacity that Russian military sustainability depended on at a pace and geographic scope that Russian civil defense and hardening measures had not been designed to manage. Russia's response in the immediate aftermath of the week's strikes reflected an institutional system, processing a strategic shock whose dimensions it was still measuring. The military response was the standard retaliatory strike against Ukrainian energy and civilian infrastructure, a pattern that Russia had used consistently throughout the war to impose costs on the Ukrainian civilian population when Ukrainian military operations had produced Russian military losses. The retaliatory strikes were real in their damage and real in their cost to Ukrainian civilians managing an energy system that had been repeatedly targeted over 3 years. They were also as an indicator of Russia's capacity to shape strategic dynamic that Ukraine's new strike strategy had established, insufficient retaliation against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure imposes costs on Ukraine. It does not reverse the degradation that the week's operations have produced in Russian air defense positioning, Russian logistics throughput, or Russian defense industrial capacity. The asymmetry between what Ukraine had achieved through the week's operations and what Russia's retaliatory strikes could achieve in response was not lost on either side's military analysts. The Russian Defense Ministry's public communication about the week's events went through its standard management sequence: initial minimization, progressive acknowledgement, adjusted toward reality as external evidence accumulated. The framing of all Ukrainian strikes as Western escalation, enabled by the provision of advanced systems and projection of continued confidence in the overall military trajectory. The specific challenge the new strategy's domestic production component created for this communication sequence was that the framing of Ukrainian strikes as Western escalation enabled by Western systems was less persuasive when the primary new system was domestically produced, a fact that Ukrainian officials were careful to communicate publicly, and that Russian officials found difficult to counter without implicitly acknowledging that Ukrainian defense industrial development had reached a level of capability that the official Russian narrative had consistently described as beyond Ukraine's reach. In Western capitals, the week's operations produced an acceleration of the reassessment that the Alabuga and Crimea operations had begun. The specific analytical question that defense ministries and intelligence services had been working through since the beginning of May was whether the Ukrainian military's demonstrated operational capacity represented a durable shift in the war's underlying dynamic or a temporary peak performance that would regress toward the prior baseline. As the specific conditions that had enabled it, the intelligence preparation, the element of surprise, the specific operational windows, were no longer available, the week of May 19th made the durable shift interpretation more credible than the temporary peak interpretation, because the new strategy's effectiveness was not dependent on the element of surprise in the way that the Crimea operations electronic warfare component had been. The sequential package architecture, the distributed targeting network, and the domestic long-range system could all be used repeatedly, without the one-time advantage of novelty that single innovative operations depend on, and their combination created a strike capability whose sustainability derived from systematic methodology rather than the exploitation of specific intelligence windows. The governments most directly affected by this reassessment were the ones whose support decisions for Ukraine had been calibrated against a war whose trajectory they had assessed as moving toward a stable, if costly, stalemate, rather than a dynamic whose momentum was shifting in ways that made the end point of the conflict less distant than it had appeared. For those governments, the week of May 19th was not simply a military story. It was an investment story, a signal that the resources committed to Ukrainian defense capability had produced an operational architecture capable of outcomes that the earlier trajectory of the conflict had not made visible, and that the cost-benefit calculation for continued and potentially expanded support had shifted in ways that warranted reassessment of the support decisions that had been calibrated against the earlier trajectory. For Russia, the new strategy's implications were not primarily about what the week of May 19th had destroyed, significant as those destructions were. They were about what the week had demonstrated about the future operating environment that Russian military planning would need to account for. The strike envelope had expanded permanently. The domestic long-range system could not be uninvented, and the production capacity to sustain it at operational scale had been demonstrated. The sequential package architecture had been operationalized. Russian air defense systems would face it again, with the specific advantage of novelty gone and the specific disadvantage of having to manage a methodology designed to exploit the characteristics of those systems. The distributed targeting network had been proven against mobile targets. Russian logistics operations on routes that had previously been effectively protected by mobility would now be conducted against a targeting background qualitatively different from the one they had been planned around. Each of those permanent changes required a Russian military response, and each response would consume resources, equipment, personnel, planning capacity, and the institutional attention of a military leadership already managing the convergence of pressures that the preceding weeks had produced. The accumulation of required responses across all three dimensions simultaneously was the specific strategic weight of what Ukraine's new strike strategy had changed. Not a single decisive blow, not the kind of dramatic rupture that produces a datable turning point, but a systematic shift in the conditions under which Russia could sustain its current approach to the conflict. A shift that, like the other shifts of the preceding weeks, would express itself gradually in the operational outcomes of the months that followed, rather than in any single headline-generating moment. The soldiers on both sides of the front line were still in their positions. The families were still waiting. The accumulated cost of 3 years was still there, unchangeable and compounding. What had changed in a week that Russia had not expected and whose implications it was still working to fully assess was the strategic picture visible to every government, every military planner, and every analyst watching this conflict with the specific purpose of understanding where it was going. That picture had shifted. The new strike strategy had changed what Ukraine could reach, how it could structure the reaching, and how sustainably it could do both. Russia had not expected it. The Kremlin was processing what it meant, and the conflict's trajectory, for the first time in months, was moving in a direction that the people who had been waiting 3 years for it to move might, with appropriate caution and without premature certainty, allow themselves to notice. What do you think? Does Ukraine's new strike strategy represent the decisive shift that changes the war's final outcome, or will Russia's demonstrated capacity for adaptation absorb this development the way it has absorbed the previous Ukrainian crowds? Operational innovations. Drop your answer in the comments below. Every comment pushes this video to more people who need to see the full picture. And if this is the kind of reporting you want, to complete, independent, no shortcuts, no spin subscribe. This channel covers what others skip. It is fully independent and the support link is below. Every contribution goes directly into keeping this work going.